This is Fusion Capitalism, a clean energy vision for conservatives. Brought to you by industry leader and company CEO, Steve Malink. Here's Steve.
Joining me this week is Mark Rothleder, the Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at California Independent System Operator, one of the largest ISOs in the world, delivering 300 million megawatt hours of electricity each year and managing about 80% of California's electric supply. California ISO oversees the operation of the state's bulk electric power system, transmission lines, and electricity generated and transmitted by its member utilities. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me.
So, Mark, from what I understand, you were employee number 4 at California ISO back in 1997. What kind of electric grid management system did California have before then? And what was the purpose of establishing the California ISO?
So prior to 1997, the operations of the grid was the responsibility of the effectively the local utilities. And in California, that was mainly driven by Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric were the three investor-owned utilities who effectively operated the grid for their service territory. And bringing the California ISO into this basically combined up the operations of the grid across those utility footprints. And what I mean by that is it basically opened up the ability for the transmission system, the big wires you see out when you're driving around. It provided open access to those wires so that people had non-discriminatory access to those wires under deregulation.
Okay. So now that you've been there 25 years, what are some of the biggest changes you've seen over that time period?
Oh, huge changes. The types of resources that we're using for really delivering energy, secure, reliable energy to the grid is really in the process of changing. It used to be, at least in California, that was mainly gas, hydro, nuclear resources. You see the big shift now to renewable resources, solar, wind, geothermal, and small hydro. And biomass and biogas. So that's really the shift. And obviously, those new resources have different operational characteristics that we have to be cognizant of maintaining a reliable grid.
Okay. Is there much of a difference between how the California ISO operates versus its counterparts in other regions of the country?
Obviously, there's some similarities. All ISOs will have the responsibility of maintaining reliability. Basically, reliability to us means that we're constantly balancing supply and demand. And then the second piece of it is making sure that the grid infrastructure is operating within its limitations. You're not overloading a line, you're not causing lines to sag into trees, and you're also prepared for contingencies. And preparing for contingencies has multiple aspects to it. One is that you have operating reserves. In other words, you have reserves in case you lose a large resource. You know you can balance the system by ramping up another resource that you have in reserves, and you have to maintain those reserves. But contingency management also means that you, in case a line trips, comes out of service, the natural flow of electricity in the parallel lines doesn't cause an overload itself. And that's all part of security of the system. I guess the last piece of it is really maybe a resiliency one, and that is in case you have an event that causes large portions of the system to be unavailable, how do you return those things in a timely manner and reduce the impact of that?
Can you tell us more how you balance the supply and demand of power on the grid? And how quickly can you increase the supply if necessary, and how quickly can you reduce demand if necessary?
So that one of the big changes from what the utilities used to do to what we do is we have a marketplace that is running in parallel that is kind of doing that balancing of supply and demand. So if you think about it, if you need one more increment of electricity, we call it a megawatt of electricity on the system to do that balancing because the demand increased by 1 megawatt. How do you do that? Well, you can do that by basically running a market that says, where is the next lowest cost increment of energy to serve that one additional megawatt of demand? That is the marketplace that is actually doing the balancing. Prior to the market doing that and the marketplace doing that, and ensuring security, no overloads, and all that, the utilities would do that on a system wide basis, just looking at their own costs of their own resources and doing that through what's called automatic generation control. The marketplace is doing that, allowing now all resources to compete to provide that balancing capability, but it also provides the ability to ensure security across the whole system and price at a locational level what the price is for energy at any location in the system based on those constraints. So it's a more sophisticated, more open, and competitive market process than what was done before to do that balancing. By the way, when I say balancing, it has a how people see that balancing is we actually maintain 60 hertz, and 60 hertz is basically the frequency of the system. And so if we don't do that balancing correctly, we can slow or speed up time
Hmm.
because that 60 hertz is being used for setting of clocks and so forth.
I see. Mark, what are your thoughts on integrating these regional grid systems into one larger national grid system that is perhaps more resilient? For example, when the grid has insufficient power in one region, it can receive power from another region, maybe like what we saw in what happened in Texas in January of this year.
To me, I see the importance of regional collaboration and connectivity. And yes, the system is right now broken up into kind of three interconnected systems that are not connected to each other. Uh, California ISO is part of the Western interconnection. And you can think of that as everything west of Colorado, including Colorado to the west, is part of the Western interconnection. And we see the real benefits of that regional collaboration and coordination because, as you stated, it allows for a response when you need it in one area from a set of diverse resources and getting energy to other parts of the system. And it really makes an efficient use of the transmission system at any given time. We've set up what's called an energy imbalance market in California ISO that actually allows for this real-time balancing on a 5-minute basis to be done across now almost 67% of the West. So while we're the California ISO and we operate the grid within the California ISO footprint, we actually operate a balancing market over 67% of the West.
Okay. What kind of problems are created by having these separate ISOs within the Western region?
So we're actually the only ISO in the Western interconnection, at least in the U.S. Western interconnection. There is another ISO in Canada, Alberta. And so wide parts of the West, other than this real-time balancing service that we operate, everything is done bilaterally. It's not done through a centralized market optimization. And that is the opportunity that we see going forward is to actually provide for a optimize market across the Western interconnection. And you may hear about things, something about, well, will there be a regional transmission organization across the West, an RTO? That is a ISO across the interconnection. We don't have that at this point, but it is an opportunity. And as the West sees the benefits of collaborating, coordinating, and centralize and optimizing that dispatch all the way from a day ahead process through real time, that's a real possibility and
Hmm.
it creates real opportunity.
I see. Obviously, wildfires along the West Coast have become a common occurrence. Besides the obvious damage this does to the forests and thousands of homes, what problems does this pose for California's electric grid?
Well, climate change and specifically fire risk is a significant impact on the reliability of the grid. Two aspects of it. One is obviously if fires cause transmission lines to trip, it impedes our ability or prevents our ability of transferring energy from other parts of the West or even within the California system. And it disturbs our ability significantly, at least during summer high load conditions. It significantly could impact our ability to balance that supply and demand at any given point because lines are basically affected that are providing large amounts of transfer into the system. The second piece of it is probably something that is newer, and that is some of the proactive preventive measures that we are now taking, or the state is taking, the utilities are taking to actually mitigate the risk of starting a wildfire. And that situation is you're through power system shutoffs. They're basically trying to take lines out of service as a preventive measure. And once again, once you take lines out of service, it can impede the ability to serve customers locally if it's a distribution line. But if you're taking large amounts of transmission out of service, it could impede our ability to maintain that supply and demand balance and ensure reliability. So it's a necessary measure because you certainly don't want to start a wildfire with the electric infrastructure, but it does create real challenges in operating a grid where you're taking large amounts of system or infrastructure out of service.
Hmm.
Now, the response to that is maybe you need to put like local microgrids in place so that you can serve local communities when you have those PSPS events, and that's creating basically new innovative solutions to the challenge.
And so are microgrids becoming a bigger part of the solution to the larger problem, would you say?
In localized areas, they certainly are providing a role to help ensure that localized customers are not affected when these lines are
Hmm.
taken out of service or they're islanded off. And so it does build resiliency in by building those microgrids. And those microgrids to provide some benefit to the broader grid because it actually helps unload the grid when we're in high stress conditions.
Hmm. And so are these safeguards like microgrids the same solution that you would say we need for not only wildfires, but cyber attacks or terrorism?
Certainly, it provides certain benefits there. If you have defense by being able to break up the system, it's kind of the opposite of what we talked about earlier. There's there's
Hmm.
benefits of kind of collaborating and integrating and working with your neighbors and transferring energy across the large parts of the system, both economic and reliability benefits. At the same time, if you are islanded off for some reason and you want to kind of protect the system in case of attack or in case of wildfires, having local infrastructure microgrids provides you the ability to do that.
That makes
Um,
sense.
you kind of need both. You really need both kind of a strategy of how to make best use of the entire infrastructure and the regional infrastructure. At the same time, you want to use whatever local capabilities to provide local resiliency. And it's
Hmm.
not one or the other. In my mind, it's both.
I see. That makes sense. Okay, hang on, Mark. We have to take a break. But coming up in the second part of my conversation with Mark Rothleder, the Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at California ISO, Mark shares when he expects the Golden State to get to 100% clean energy on the grid.
I think it's accelerating, and I think the pressures are increasing to do that. And when I say the pressures, I mean that in various aspects.
Thanks for listening to Fusion Capitalism. To find out more about Steve Malink and his book, go to fusioncapitalism.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.